You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This is Michael Medved. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, once said that God offers special protection to drunkards, lost dogs, children, and the United States of America. We'll explore that special protection and what it means in The American Miracle. Subscribe to The American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The corporate world is like the ocean. It's alluring, but it's also full of deadly creatures that can shred you to pieces.
It becomes kind of like a Game of Thrones political arena where everyone's trying to murder you to get your job.
My family doesn't come from corporate background, so I didn't have any sort of guidance in that.
This is not your typical work podcast.
Sometimes you need to be empathetic. And then there are times that you ask for input, but you don't really give a shit.
Listen to the Ambie Award-nominated podcast, Surfing Corporate.
Stretch opportunity? What is this, yoga class? Get out of here.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 183, The Fall of France, the Invasion of Belgium. This week, a big thank you goes out to Matthew, Tom, Wyatt, Meredith, and Neil for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. Last episode discussed the German invasion of the Netherlands, one of several neutral nations that German forces would invade during their French campaign. Another would be Belgium. Belgian neutrality was an interesting topic during the interwar years, as for most of the period between the wars, Belgium was not in fact neutral. In 1914, it had been neutral, but that had not stopped the Germans from invading southern Belgium on their way to France. And then, of course, during the war, there was a lot of fighting on Belgian soil. Then, in the years after the conflict ended, Belgium worked closely with France on military plans and continued to pressure the Germans to fulfill their obligations, as described in the Treaty of Versailles. But then, in 1936, the Belgian government did an about-face and brought the nation back into its neutral position, in the belief that this would reduce the possibility of a German invasion. As with so many other nations around Europe, these decisions were driven out of a mixture of sort of fear and helplessness. Belgium was very vulnerable to a German attack, and it was clear that its military forces were no match for what Germany could bring to bear, especially after Germany started rearmament. This pushed many Belgian politicians, and many Belgians themselves, to the belief that the best course of action was to try and just stay out of whatever was going to happen next. This idea seemed to crash down when the Germans invaded Poland, but throughout the phony war period, Belgian neutrality was officially maintained. During the 1920s and early 1930s, the Belgian and French military leaders had many discussions about what would happen in a war with Germany. They both agreed that the best plan was for the Belgian forces on the German border to hold on to their defensive positions as long as possible, while the French army rushed into Belgium to assist. This plan served the interest of both nations, as it would allow the Belgians to retain control of as much of their territory as possible, while for the French it pushed the front line out of France. Even while maintaining official neutrality after 1936 and then during the phony war period, this plan was reaffirmed, with the Belgian military attaché in Paris working with the French to determine how much assistance could be expected within 4 days of the German attack. Another way in which the two nations worked together was through the sharing of intelligence information. In retrospect, the most important of these messages was a series of intelligence reports shared in early March by the Belgians, which indicated that the Germans were moving some of their troops further south to the area around the Ardennes. This was still part of the Belgian border, or at least part of it was, but the assumption had been, up to that point, that the primary point of German effort would be further north along the Belgian plain. The information from Belgian intelligence confirmed what the French had already detected, but there was still very little concern at French headquarters, as they still believed that the strongest German forces would attack in the north, and that any attack through the Ardennes could be defeated with what was there. The story of what was happening in the Ardennes is for a future episode, and this episode will be broken up into two different parts. The first will discuss the first German attacks into Belgium on May 10th, and in the second half, we'll look at the information that the French leaders had between May 10th and May 13th as they reacted to German actions, or what they thought the German actions were, while the Belgians bought them time. While the Belgian army was heavily outnumbered by the German forces that could be arrayed against it, the size and power of the Belgians was not something that could be completely ignored. In total, the Belgian army mobilized between 600 and 650,000 men during the war, and these were arranged in 22 total divisions, including 2 divisions of troops specifically equipped and trained to fight in the Ardennes, and then 2 motorized cavalry divisions. Most of the troops were dedicated to defending the fortifications along the Meuse River and the Albert Canal, which had been fortified with casemates and fortresses over the years. This stood directly in the way of the primary goal of the possible or the expected German attack, which was to get across the Meuse as quickly as possible. But it was hoped that the Belgian forces, protected by the fixed fortifications, could hold the Germans for up to 72 hours, which would allow the British and French forces time to push up to the Dial line, which was sort of their plan from before the war. Regardless of the presence of those Allied forces, the Belgian plan was always to retreat to the Dial when the Meuse could no longer be held, and that point would come eventually. They weren't going to hold the Meuse forever. The primary challenge that the Belgian forces would face was around equipment. Equipment was always a challenge for these smaller armies, and the Belgians were no different. They did have a decent number of 47mm anti-tank guns, which would prove to be effective, but they were deficient in many other areas of equipment, particularly in artillery. There was also a general shortage of aircraft, which would be important in the opening moments of the German attack on May 10th. On the German side, on the afternoon of the 9th, it had been announced to the Luftwaffe forces through the use of the code word Danzig that the attack would begin the next day, and this put into action the Luftwaffe's Luftflotte 3 and Luftflotte 2, which would launch attacks on French, Dutch, and Belgian airfields to open the attack. The goal of these attacks was, of course, to destroy as many enemy aircraft as possible, and for this purpose, around 500 bombers would attack 72 different airfields. This was then followed up by a second wave of 500 bombers that arrived 90 minutes after the first, with some target overlap. These opening strikes were quite effective against the Belgian and Dutch air forces, with both losing around half of their total aircraft just in the first few hours of the attack. They would be less successful against the British and French, who were able not just to prevent the worst of the bombing, but also to destroy several German bombers as soon as Allied fighters were able to get in the air. This was once again an example of the challenges that bombers in the early war years had when facing fighters without their own fighter escort, something that all of the sides during the French campaign would learn. But they would not learn this lesson fast enough for all the airmen that would die over the following weeks. The early German offensive efforts in the air would also provide cover for what was becoming a trend in German offensives, an airborne drop. In this case, the target of the airborne troops was the French fortress of Eben Emael. This fortification was very new, having been completed in 1935 to defend the stretch of the Meuse about 6 miles from Maastricht. It was situated near the river and incorporated all of the best practices of fortress design in the 1930s. It had 3 levels, 2 of which were completely below ground. Each of the levels could be sealed off from one another through the use of heavy armored doors. This was to help protect the 1,200-man garrison from possible enemy infiltration attacks, and it would also allow them to use the 30 artillery pieces that were built into the fort for their maximum effect and for their maximum duration. This artillery ranged from 120mm all the way down to 60mm anti-tank guns, and the largest guns had a range of over 10 miles, which allowed them to command a wide swath of the surrounding territory, particularly some crossings over the Meuse. The presence of the Meuse and a canal that the Germans would have to cross made these artillery pieces even more dangerous, because they were able to protect the crossings, the water obstacles, which would funnel German forces down into just a few very small areas where the artillery could kind of take control. There was, however, one major problem. A problem that the Germans would be able to take advantage of because there was a large flat meadow that was built on top of the fort's concrete roof, with the soil and grass designed to provide extra protection from airborne bombs or from artillery. However, if you have airborne forces, you really want a nice flat piece of ground to land on. and the Belgians had created a perfectly flat piece of ground. And it was, unfortunately, completely free of obstacles because it was man-made. It was a great landing zone. It was perfect. The Belgian designers and defenders completely underestimated the possibility of an airborne attack. And so the top of the fortress, this quite vulnerable and perfect area for airborne troops, was protected by only a couple of machine guns. It would be the fatal flaw. A tremendous amount of effort had been put into preparing for an attack on the fortress, including the creation of special groups of German airborne infantry and combat engineers. They had even went to the fortresses in Czechoslovakia that had been built in the Sudetenland to practice their assault and the usage of specially designed hollow charges that could destroy the doors or other fortifications in the area. These would be brought in via 11 gliders, which would land on top of the fort. Now, only 9 of the gliders would actually reach their objective, with 1 or 2 having some challenges, including the one that contained the commander of the airborne units. But that was okay. The men landed and quickly got to work. The communications between the fort and the outside world were quickly cut off, and the machine guns that were positioned on the top of the fortress were quickly neutralized. The group of German forces then went to work disabling some of the fort's guns from the outside. A nearby Belgian infantry unit did try to mount a counterattack, but it was unsuccessful. For almost 24 hours, this small group of airborne infantry continued to fight the fort's occupants, while waiting to be relieved by the German ground forces that were approaching. 2 small groups of German paratroopers also dropped near 2 bridges nearby over the Albert Canal, and were in similarly sort of almost desperate situations, trying to hold on to small pieces of territory to protect the bridges so that the German troops could cross. Remarkably, these units could have easily been wiped out, all 3 of them, on the fort, at the bridges. They could have been wiped out if the Belgian units that were stationed nearby had launched a concerted counterattack. There were more than enough infantry troops in the area to just overwhelm these small German detachments, but they did not do so. And eventually, it would simply be too late, as the guns of Aben Amal would eventually be disabled, and the German advance over the bridges on the Meuse and the Albert Canal would begin in force, pushing all of the Belgian forces in the area back from the river. The lack of action near Aben Amal was just one example of a larger problem for the Belgian forces, a general lack of drive among the commanders of the Belgian defending units. As with any river crossing, amphibious landing, airborne assault, anything like that, the best time for the defenders to defeat the enemy is right when they have as few people across the river or down from their airplanes as possible. During most of the day on May 10th, there were very few German troops west of the Meuse, and they were simply trying to hold on until the real German invasion forces arrived, which would not occur until the morning of May 11th. But instead of any kind of counterattack, the Belgian forces in the area simply began to disengage and retreat almost as soon as the German attack began. This then had a ripple effect on the defending troops along the entire frontier. And when the 7th Infantry Division began to retreat from the area around Aben Amal, then the rest of the 1st Corps would do the same. To the south of the 1st Corps, the 3rd Corps was positioned in the areas in and around Liège. And when they realized that the 1st Corps was retreating, well, they began to evacuate Liège as well, even though they had not even been attacked by any German units. They would leave behind the over 6,000 garrison troops at Liège to fight alone, without the infantry troops that were essential to prevent the fortifications from being surrounded and defeated in detail. This is exactly what would happen when the German troops of the 6th Army arrived in the days that followed. All the positions were surrounded and then neutralized. The retreat of the Belgian 1st and 3rd Corps essentially ended any possibility that the Belgian army had of slowing down the German attack in the area, as it was on the Meuse and the Albert Canal that the Germans would find it difficult to use their advantages in equipment and numbers. And while I'm being critical of the Belgian officers in charge of these units, quite critical actually, they were in some ways just following the plan. The plan was to retreat from the German attack, and the Belgian leaders were under no illusions that they could hold the Germans on the border for any length of time. But the hope was that the units could slow and maybe even stop the German advance for a period of time, and the Belgian units just kind of skipped that part of the plan. Further to the south, the Belgian defenders in the Ardennes would be able to delay the German advance a little longer, for a few hours, But they would also be pushed back, even though, much like along the Meuse, the Ardennes was one of the areas where the Belgians had the best chance of meaningfully slowing the German advance, and they had the troops to do it, they had the tactics to do it. It was all possible. Instead, the retreat would begin, and it would continue in the days that followed. On both sides, this resulted in constant marching among the foot infantry, which would make it challenging for the defense to re-solidify around any defensive line, although the German infantry would become equally as tired. Here's an account from a German infantryman after only a few days of the offensive. Quote, "There was little sleep. We slept where we fell, on our packs. Little time for anything, really. Often we had to be told to eat or else we would drift off standing up. The intensity was unremitting from the first day to the last, a blur of marching, fighting, weapon maintenance. We didn't know where we were or when it would end." End quote. Luckily for the German infantry, the German army had another tool that they could use to continue to keep the attack going: the armored units of the panzer divisions. These divisions would advance into Belgium, along with troops further south, and we will discuss their attacks against the Belgian and French forces in central Belgium next episode.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
With the benefit of hindsight, we know that the assumptions made by the French military leaders in the first 3 days after the German attack were critical to the overall course of the campaign. Their reaction, or lack of reaction, to exactly what the Germans were doing would set them up for a military disaster that probably could have been avoided if different decisions had been made. The most important of these decisions was the understanding and belief that the primary German attack was going to come through central Belgium, and then believing that this was still the case as the German attack developed. This meant that even as late as May 12th, as the German armored units began to approach the Meuse to the south near Sedan, French military high command was still convinced that it was in central Belgium that the campaign would be decided. The idea that the Germans were following the same basic template as they had in 1914 had been a fixture of French planning for the entire interwar period, and during the first days of the attack, the information available seemed to confirm these assumptions. In the early hours of May 10th, reports had arrived that the Germans were attacking along the Meuse and Albert Canal near Maastricht, and that they were in some way attacking the fortress of Ibn Amal. This was combined with information about the German attacks into the Netherlands, and all of this perfectly came into line with what the opening moves of a German offensive that was focused on pushing strong German forces through central Belgium would have been like. It was looking exactly how the French expected. That the French would believe that this was the main point of German effort was exactly what the Germans intended, and they had put a lot of work into making it fit with the preconceived notions of the French and Gamelin and other French leaders. Along with this, there were German efforts to make it appear that the Germans might also attack through Switzerland, with German intelligence trying to mislead the French into believing that there was a serious threat to the French right on the far southern end of the Maginot Line. Now, this attack was never going to happen. But misleading information was planted around there being specialist and elite combat formations moved into the area south of Maginot to try and to deceive the French. The threat was even large enough that it was openly discussed among major Allied leaders, and it would result in the retention of more French forces than otherwise would have been kept in the south of France, out of fear that the Germans were going to attack through Switzerland. Even though there was this possible threat to the south, in London and Paris, all eyes were fixed on central Belgium. Reports began arriving early on May 10th that there was some action occurring in the Ardennes, with the German invasion of Luxembourg happening early in the day, and then aerial reconnaissance flights reporting that German motorized and armored forces were moving into the area. But these movements were not completely outside of what the French were expecting, with the belief being that the Germans were sure to move at least some forces through the Ardennes. It was logical that these forces would be moved through the area to protect the left flank of the Germans further north in Belgium. All of this information was then fed up through the chain of command in intelligence reports, and it was the content of these reports which would have a major impact on the overall course of the campaign. A summary of aerial intelligence was provided early on the 11th of May, which drew some conclusions about the German attack, stating that, quote, "In summary, the great impression drawn from intelligence received seems to be A. Principal enemy effort in the region between Maastricht and Nijmegen. B. Secondary effort but extremely strong to the west of Luxembourg through the Ardennes. C. Very moderate advance in the region of Liège." End quote. The intelligence from the French Second Army, which was guarding the front along the Ardennes, similarly downplayed the German forces that were advancing in their direction, with one summary report ending with, quote, "The enemy seems to be pressing himself in force in front of the Second Army. As a consequence, our light divisions have accomplished the prescribed delaying action in a rhythm that appears normal." End quote. Another report would state, quote, "Enemy motorized elements have been pushed back by the Chasseurs Ardennes, and they have come in contact with our covering force elements. Belgian obstacles seem to have been sufficient to halt the progress of the enemy. There have been no indications of armored vehicles on the army's front." End quote. Again, that is a summary of an intelligence report from the Second Army, right at the Ardennes, right where the German armored divisions were about to sort of crash through. Now, importantly, these were the types of reports that were sent up to Gamelin's headquarters at French High Command. The reports coming into the Second Army and other French headquarters were confusing. They were contradictory. They were inconsistently delivered. They downplayed possible threats. They played up, phantom threats. At every step of the process, when information was incomplete, assumptions were made to fill in the gaps based on what the French assumed the Germans were doing. As you can see already in some of those quotes I gave, there was references to expectations or plans or things being normal or not normal. This created a situation where there was little being told to French High Command that greatly altered their views of the German intentions in these critical early days of the attack, and that would lead to disaster. The general assumption that the Germans were doing what was expected of them continued throughout the 11th of May, as there was fighting all along the front, but the strongest German efforts seemed to be in the north on the Belgian plain. There were continued reports of German units in the Ardennes, but there was no firm information that there were large German armored units moving through the area. French focus was instead on preparing to fight the Germans in Belgium near the Gembloux Gap, which will be the topic for our next episode. Although the French commanders also at least took the step of ordering some units to reinforce the 2nd and 9th armies, which would be the targets of any German troops that managed to move through the Ardennes forest and launched an attack. The summary report of aerial intelligence that was provided on the 12th of May once again did not necessarily prompt any changes. The reports from the Second Army on that day did mention that German armored units had been present, but the report provided would kind of downplay any possible concern, stating, quote, "In spite of pressure from the enemy and the presence of tanks, our front has not been ruptured at any point, and the delaying action occurred under satisfactory conditions." End quote. It would not be until the morning of the 13th, just hours before German troops would cross the river at Sedan, that French intelligence reports began to correctly identify the areas around the Ardennes as the point of greatest concern for the French. The first crossing would occur at 4 p.m. on the 13th, and on that same day, the Second Army would continue to downplay the problems that it was experiencing, stating, quote, "Overall impression is very good," end quote. And yes, that's an actual quote from a report. It's very optimistic, and it should have been, bad, very bad. The reason I've brought these conversations forward into this episode, before we even cover the fighting in Belgium and the Ardennes, which will be the subjects for the next several episodes, is because of the importance of the mistake that was made by the French leaders in simply guessing incorrectly where the primary point of German effort would be. But those guesses were made, especially at the higher levels of French command, using information that in no way supported any other conclusion. The Germans made a concerted effort to deceive the French leaders, and many French intelligence reports from the front just amplified these efforts. German air support was focused on central Belgium, German armored forces would be showcased at Hanout and Gembloux, and French intelligence reports downplayed information that they did have about German forces in the Ardennes. It's very easy to criticize Gamelin and other French military leaders for making the wrong decisions during this period, but to do otherwise during the first 3 days of the campaign would have been to go against the information that they had in front of them. Instead, the mistakes came before and after. Before the war, they did a poor job of preparing the French army to react to unexpected situations, and did not foster a force that was ready to react and respond. And then after the German attack developed, those in French high command did a poor job of properly reacting and using the resources that they did have to respond to the threat. They failed, but not because they guessed wrong, but instead because they'd not properly prepared for possibly guessing wrong, which should always be considered a possibility. I hope you will join me next episode, in which we will talk about the fighting in central Belgium, in which the French forces, the best French forces in the French army, actually did pretty good.